I'll be blunt at 3 in the morning. 16 cement trucks rolled down my street like an invasion, headlights cutting through the dark, and they stopped right behind my backyard creek. They started pouring concrete over a living stream, decades of clear water, salamanders, and stones, as if nature were trash to be shoveled away. I sat on my porch with my coffee and watched them bury it. My name is Ezra. I'm 58, been a plumber for 30 years, and I know two things like clockwork, water always wins, and people with money sometimes believe they're smarter than the laws of physics. I moved into this little cottage because the land had a voice, a creek that sang over mossy stones, the kind of sound that made my late wife Sarah call it nature's lullaby. It was honest. It smelled like wet earth and wildflowers, not the fake mulch scent people spray on their lawns. Then Brittany moved in, HOA, president in training, real estate smile, workout clothes that never saw sweat, and a white car that announced she had opinions. 3 weeks later, she was at my door, syrupy voice, clipboard in hand. Welcome to the neighborhood. We maintain standards. That swampy area behind your house, it's lowering property values. She called a 100-year-old creek a swamp, and that's when a small war started. 2 days after her first smile, I got a notice violation of landscaping standards section this and that, a fine 10 days to comply. I read the HOA rules that night with a flashlight. They obsessively regulated mailbox colors and grass height, but not a word about natural waterways. The thing is, the original engineers had built around that creek on purpose. That creek handled runoff for the whole hillside. It was not an aesthetic flaw, it was infrastructure in plain clothes. You want to know what's funny? Plumbers understand pressure. You block one outlet, pressure builds somewhere else. I'd spent years fixing other people's improvements. So when someone decided to improve Mother Nature with concrete, I watched curious and quietly worried. Spring rained. 3 days of steady downpour, no apocalypse, just normal runoff. The creek did its job the way it had for decades. Then the complaints started. Brittany called an emergency HOA meeting complete with slides. Drainage crisis, immediate action required. Slide 23 showed the creek full but flowing. Slide 24 showed a neighbor's decorative fountain overflowing right where a natural swale used to be. She clicked her laser pointer like it was a diagnosis. I kept thinking of an old mentor who said, "When you see water where it shouldn't be, look for something somebody moved that used to be there." Harold, a retired county drainage engineer who'd lived on this street forever, stood up and said the obvious. That creek's been handling the runoff since before these houses were built. If you block it, you invite flooding. Brittany smiled, and that smile had ice in it. But outside, the creek kept its century-old job, whispering at its stones. Harold and I walked the banks after the meeting. His hands traced the soil like a man reading a blueprint in Braille. "She's planning something stupid," he said. Then the letters started. A city complaint claimed I'd built an illegal dam. An inspector came out, measured the flow, photographed the bedrock, and made a report: natural waterway. Predates development. No illegal dam. While he worked, I walked upstream and found fresh concrete footings where I realized the builder's storm system had been patched in a hurry. The same company that built the neighborhood had shortcuts in places you don't see during open houses downstream. Foundations skimped on drains, undersized storm lines, paperwork suggesting they'd hoped the creek would do the heavy lifting. That was the twist, the thing that turned this from petty HOA drama to a conspiracy wrapped in landscaping fabric. The creek wasn't the problem. It was the cover. The developer had used the creek as free infrastructure, and when sales slowed, they decided to hide the evidence. Concrete over a stream was a brilliant PR move until physics and rain proved otherwise. Brittany moved faster than any homeowner I'd seen. One morning at dawn, the concrete trucks showed up and started pouring. I made coffee and watched them bury life under gray slurry. Within hours, the creek's natural bed was a hard, angry channel. Tadpoles and salamanders that had lived there vanished or floundered. The smell of diesel and curing cement replaced moss and clean water. It was awful, like watching someone repaint a cathedral with cement. Of course, because water is stubborn and honest, things began to go sideways. A light shower that week sent runoff ricocheting off the new concrete and straight into Brittany's foundation plantings. Her prize azaleas found themselves standing in puddles. Her basement window wells collected standing water for the first time since the house was built. Driveways developed hairline cracks. Pool decks settled. Neighbors who'd previously bragged about custom landscaping started seeing foundation lines spiderwebbing across their floors. I started documenting. From my years in unions and dealing with municipal nonsense, I knew two things. Documentation beats intimidation, and patterns are your friend. I photographed cracks, noted dates and times, kept logs. Harold helped interpret readings. Margaret, a widow who'd lived here since before the luxury lots, whispered tales over her fence, how she'd once been forced to replace a perfectly good deck because Brittany had declared it structurally unsound. There was a patterned selective enforcement targeting longtime residents in modest homes with fines until they folded. Then things got ugly. Cameras I'd set up to monitor erosion were smashed. Someone used a club. Anonymous flyers showed up on doors accusing me of being unstable. A private investigator knocked on my door and admitted he'd been hired to dig up dirt on me. He sighed and said, "You're not interesting. You paid taxes, you worked steady, your wife's passed. There's nothing." He slid a folder across the table with photos of construction corners cut around the neighborhood. He'd been hired to slander me and ended up handing me evidence against the people who hired him. That night, Rick the developer came by with a leather briefcase and an offer. $50,000 in cash, relocation assistance, the whole "we can make this go away" package. I closed the briefcase without touching the money. "You can't buy physics," I told him. He didn't smile. I sued. Not because I wanted money, because somebody had altered a natural waterway without permits, and federal and state environmental laws don't play favorites. I hired a lawyer, Jim, who'd handled my late wife's estate, and Dr. Kim, an environmental scientist from the community college, who brought grad students with instruments that looked like Mars gear. They measured groundwater pressure, soil saturation, and the readings matched what my gut had said for weeks: eliminate natural drainage, and the water table rises. Hydrostatic pressure builds. Foundations that were marginal to start will shift. By the time the Weather Service issued flash flood warnings, we had weeks of documented evidence. Late that night, the real storm hit. I sat on my porch with coffee, watching water climb levels I'd logged in pictures. The concrete channel, designed for tidy brochure photos, not heavy rain, acted like a strainer shooting water straight into yards and foundations. Family after family watched as basements flooded. Emergency crews red-tagged houses. The scene was cinematic in the worst way. Live TV crews wading through a neighborhood turned swamp homeowners, carrying kids and keepsakes through ankle-deep water. And there was Brittany standing on her front step in a bathrobe, soaked and furious, pointing at me like I'd personally opened the taps. The cameras picked up the moment her foundation shifted under live coverage, an ugly, grinding rumble, and she lost the audience's sympathy in real time. A federal environmental team arrived with credentials and instruments and quickly documented violations: unpermitted stream alteration, ecosystem damage, and measurable destabilization of soils and structures. The fallout was swift. Orders to stop work, restore the stream, fines that could bankrupt the HOA board, and crucially, civil action against the developer for hiding inadequate infrastructure. Rick's company was exposed. The so-called improvements were a legal and financial disaster. 3 board members quietly resigned. The HOA's special assessments, once pitched as the solution, turned into liabilities when residents realized insurance wouldn't cover their foundation damage tied to the elimination of a natural waterway. We won not because I wanted vengeance, but because the laws and the science were on our side. The creek was restored. Hydrologists designed retention areas and native plantings. The salamanders came back. The community built a small watershed education center in the renovated community space, funded in part by settlements. Margaret was elected HOA president, and the first thing she did was ban random fines as a governance tactic and start coffee and plan meetings about rain gardens, not arbitrary penalties. There's a small, sweet victory tucked in my mornings now. I sit on my porch with a mug and listen to the creek sing over stones again. It reminds me of Sarah's voice, and I like to believe she would have smiled at the outcome. The developer's loss became our lesson. The private investigator who'd been hired to smear me became someone who handed us the smoking gun. Harold's quiet knowledge and Dr. Kim's instruments turned neighborhood gossip into hard science. The twist was that the very people who tried to intimidate us handed us the evidence that brought them down. Here's the moral: plain and ugly power without understanding is dangerous. Money can hire lawyers and trucks, but it can't hire physics. If you erase the systems that quietly support life, the creeks, the swales, the soil that soaks the rain, you will eventually meet the bill. Sometimes justice comes slow in paperwork and soil samples. Sometimes it comes at 3 a.m. in a live broadcast. Either way, it's satisfying when the truth shows up. So tell me, is there a Brittany in your neighborhood, someone eager to tidy nature into a picture for a brochure? Have you ever seen a well-meaning improvement go spectacularly wrong? Drop your story. I want to hear the small battles that taught you something. If you learned anything from mine, pass it on. Sometimes listening to an old plumber or a creak is cheaper than learning the hard way.